It's 1941. The United States is at war. Thousands of American pilots are being deployed to combat zones across the globe. Fighter planes, bombers, and transport aircraft are flowing off the assembly lines at a rate never before seen in industrial history. But there's an enormous problem that nobody wants to talk about. American military pilots are dying, not just in combat, but in accidents, in transit flights, in training operations, in ferrying aircraft from factories to military bases. And the military simply doesn't have enough pilots to replace them. Then someone had a radical idea. What if, instead of sending trained combat pilots on these routine ferry flights and training exercises, you used other pilots? Pilots who were fully capable of handling sophisticated aircraft, but who were being excluded from military service for one simple reason: they were women. This is the story of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP. Over 1,000 women who tested experimental aircraft, ferried planes across America and overseas, and proved they could fly as well as any male pilot. They were pioneers, but they were also victims of a system that wanted to use their talents but refused to acknowledge their contributions. They flew faster than fighter pilots. They completed missions with precision and dedication. But history has almost completely erased them from the record. It took decades for America to officially recognize what these women accomplished. And even today, many people don't know their story. This is the untold story of the WASP. Women who fought not with weapons, but with courage and determination. Women who proved that in the skies, skill matters more than gender. To understand the WASP, we need to understand the military aviation situation in 1941 and early 1942. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered World War II. American military immediately began a massive expansion of its aviation capabilities. Thousands of new aircraft were being manufactured. Pilots were being trained at an accelerated rate. The demand for everything aviation-related seemed limitless. But there were severe logistical problems. Aircraft manufactured on the West Coast needed to be transported to military bases on the East Coast. Aircraft built in the Northeast needed to get to bases in the South. Bombers that rolled off assembly lines in California needed to reach departure points in England before being flown across the Atlantic. This transportation of aircraft required pilots. Lots of pilots. But here's the problem. Trained military pilots were desperately needed for combat operations. Every pilot flying a ferrying mission was a pilot not available for combat. Military planners estimated that nearly 60,000 pilots were needed just to transport aircraft from factories to military bases. Using combat-trained pilots for this task was inefficient and wasteful. At the same time, there were thousands of women pilots in America. Women who had learned to fly in civilian aviation schools and private flying clubs during the 1930s. Women who were fully capable of piloting sophisticated military aircraft. Women who wanted to serve their country. Women who were being denied the opportunity to contribute because of outdated regulations and gender discrimination. The solution seemed obvious. Recruit women pilots for these non-combat flying duties. In 1941, a civilian pilot named Jacqueline Cochran approached the military with this idea. Cochran had an impressive aviation record herself. She was a successful pilot, an accomplished aviator, and had broken numerous flight records. She understood what women pilots could contribute to the war effort. At first, the military rejected the idea. It was simply unthinkable to them. Women as military pilots? It violated tradition, regulation, and cultural expectations. But the need for pilots was so desperate that eventually, the military relented. In 1942, the military agreed to test a program. If women pilots could demonstrate that they could safely and effectively fly military aircraft, then perhaps a formal women's pilot program could be established. The result was the formation of the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Initially called the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the program later became officially known as the WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots. The first group of women pilots who joined the WASP faced extraordinary challenges. They didn't just face skepticism. They faced active hostility and discrimination from multiple directions. First, there was the military establishment. Many senior officers in the Army Air Forces were deeply opposed to the idea of women pilots. They didn't believe women were physically or mentally capable of piloting military aircraft. They worried that having women on military bases would create problems with discipline and morale. They feared that if women pilots made mistakes, it would prove that the entire concept was flawed and confirm their skepticism. Second, there was the male pilot community. Male pilots saw the WASP as a threat. They worried that having women pilots would somehow diminish their own status or reduce their opportunities. Some male pilots were openly hostile to the women, trying to discourage them or prove that they couldn't do the job. Third, there were the American people and the media. Public opinion was divided. Some Americans supported the idea of women serving as pilots. Others were scandalized by it. Women flying military aircraft? It seemed inappropriate, unseemly, and contradictory to traditional gender roles. And fourth, there was the government itself. The WASP program was never officially a military program. The pilots in the WASP were not given official military status. They were civilians, employed by the Civilian Civil Aeronautics Administration. This meant they received different pay than male military pilots. They received fewer benefits. They had less job security. And crucially, if something went wrong, they had less legal protection. Despite all of these obstacles, the women pilots of the WASP were determined to prove themselves. The selection process for WASP pilots was rigorous. Applicants had to have extensive flight experience. They had to pass medical examinations. They had to demonstrate exceptional flying skills. They had to be willing to endure long training programs and demanding physical challenges. Those who were accepted found themselves at training facilities where they were often the only women among hundreds of men. They lived in different quarters. They ate in separate dining facilities. They were subjected to constant scrutiny and skepticism. One of the most famous early WASP pilots was Jacqueline Cochran herself. Cochran was already an accomplished aviator before joining the WASP. She had set numerous flight records. She had flown aircraft that most male pilots had never even seen. She was confident in her abilities and unwilling to tolerate discrimination. Cochran became the director of the WASP program. She fought for the rights and recognition of the women pilots under her command. She pushed the military to expand the program. She insisted that the women pilots be given equal treatment and equal opportunities to prove their capabilities. Another legendary figure was Amelia Earhart, though her contributions to the WASP concept came before her famous disappearance in 1937. Earhart was an advocate for women pilots and had urged the military to create opportunities for women flyers. Her legacy inspired many women who joined the WASP program in the following years. As the WASP program expanded, it became clear that the women pilots were more than capable. They could fly any aircraft that male pilots could fly. They completed their assignments with precision and professionalism. They had excellent safety records. They demonstrated courage, dedication, and skill. Over 1,000 women joined the WASP program during the war years. They came from different backgrounds, different regions, and different social classes. But they shared common qualities: exceptional flying skills, determination to serve their country, and willingness to face discrimination and hostility for the opportunity to contribute. The women pilots of the WASP tested experimental aircraft. They flew bombing runs in practice flights. They transported vital aircraft to bases where they were needed. They served as test pilots for new aircraft designs and modifications. They ferried planes across oceans. They flew in dangerous conditions and challenging weather. And despite the obstacles they faced, they proved themselves repeatedly. Their safety record was excellent. Their professionalism was evident. Their contributions were undeniable. The success of the WASP program during World War II had profound implications that extended far beyond the war years themselves. By 1944, it was clear that the women pilots of the WASP had successfully proven that women could fly military aircraft safely and effectively. The original skeptics had been proven wrong. Women pilots weren't a liability. They were an asset. They brought skill, dedication, and professionalism to every mission they undertook. The WASP pilots logged over 60 million miles of flight time during the war. They delivered over 12,000 aircraft to military bases and combat zones. They tested new aircraft designs and modifications. They flew in every type of military aircraft in the American inventory, from fighters to bombers to transport planes. And remarkably, given that many of the aircraft they flew were experimental or newly designed, the WASP maintained an excellent safety record. The fatality rate among WASP pilots was comparable to or better than the fatality rate among male pilots performing similar duties. Yet despite their achievements, the WASP program faced increasing political pressure. Male pilots' organizations lobbied against the program, arguing that women pilots were taking jobs that should go to men. Military leaders who had been skeptical about the program from the beginning used the end of the war as an excuse to shut it down. In December 1944, the WASP program was officially dissolved. The women pilots were given a choice: accept discharge from the program or transfer to other positions. Most of the WASP pilots were discharged. They were told that their services were no longer needed. There were no parades welcoming the women pilots home. There were no medals or commendations. There were no official recognitions of their service. The WASP pilots simply went back to civilian life, and most of their contributions were forgotten. This was one of the most tragic aspects of the WASP story. These women had proven their capabilities. They had served their country with distinction. But when the war ended, they were simply erased from the historical record. The male pilot community worked hard to minimize the accomplishments of the WASP pilots. Textbooks about aviation history barely mentioned them. Military histories ignored their contributions. Popular culture portrayed aviation during World War II as an exclusively male domain. For decades, the public knew nothing about the WASP pilots. People who studied World War II aviation history learned about the great fighter pilots, the famous bomber formations, the heroic air battles. But the WASP pilots were invisible. Their achievements were hidden. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that historians began to recover the history of the WASP pilots. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Historians began to recognize and celebrate what these women had accomplished. In 2010, more than 60 years after the end of World War II, Congress officially awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the former WASP pilots. This medal recognized their extraordinary service and their contributions to the war effort. It was an official government acknowledgement that what they had accomplished was important and valuable. But by that time, many of the WASP pilots had already passed away. They had lived their entire lives with their wartime service largely unrecognized and uncelebrated. The WASP program demonstrated something crucial about military capability and gender. It proved that women could perform military aviation duties as well as men. It proved that when women were given equal opportunities and equal treatment, they could achieve equal results. It proved that discrimination and exclusion were based on prejudice and tradition, not on capability or competence. The legacy of the WASP pilots extended beyond World War II. In 1976, the U.S. Air Force Academy began admitting women for the first time. In 1993, women were officially authorized to serve as combat pilots in the U.S. Air Force. In subsequent years, women have become increasingly integrated into military aviation. This integration was made possible, in part, by the pioneering work of the WASP pilots in the 1940s. The women of the WASP had proven that women could fly military aircraft. They had broken barriers and shattered stereotypes. Even though their contributions were forgotten for decades, their legacy lived on in the opportunities that subsequent generations of women pilots would enjoy. The WASP program represents a crucial moment in American history. It's a moment when necessity forced the military to confront and challenge deeply held assumptions about gender, capability, and service. The WASP pilots proved something that previous generations had resisted accepting: that women were fully capable of performing complex, high-skill tasks that had been exclusively reserved for men. This proof had implications far beyond aviation. If women could pilot military aircraft, then women could do other things that had previously been considered exclusively male domains. If women could serve their country as pilots, then women should be able to serve in other military roles. If women could achieve success in challenging technical fields, then women should be able to pursue careers in science, engineering, medicine, and other professions. The WASP pilots didn't just prove their own capability. They challenged the entire system of gender discrimination that pervaded American society and military institutions. The history of the WASP pilots is also a history of erasure. It's a case study in how historical narratives can be shaped by prejudice and power. When the WASP program ended, powerful interests, male pilots organizations, military leaders who opposed women in the military, government officials who wanted to return to traditional gender roles after the war, worked to minimize and erase the contributions of the WASP pilots. Textbooks were written that ignored the WASP pilots. Military histories were compiled that didn't mention them. Popular culture portrayed World War II aviation as an exclusively male domain. Over time, the WASP pilots faded from public memory and historical consciousness. It took dedicated historians and activists to recover and restore the history of the WASP pilots. It took survivors of the program telling their stories and fighting for recognition. It took changing social attitudes about gender and military service to create the environment where the WASP pilots' contributions could finally be acknowledged and celebrated. The recovery of WASP history is an important reminder about how historical narratives are constructed and reconstructed. It shows that what we know about history is not fixed or objective. It's shaped by who has power and influence. It's shaped by whose stories are told and whose stories are forgotten. It's shaped by cultural values and social prejudices. To truly understand the WASP pilots, we need to understand the individual women who served in the program. These weren't abstract historical figures. They were real women with dreams, ambitions, and courage. Jacqueline Cochran was born in 1906, though exact details of her early life are unclear. She grew up in poverty and grew up determined to escape her circumstances through hard work and ambition. She learned to fly in the late 1920s at a time when women pilots were extremely rare. She became a commercial pilot and set numerous flight records. She was confident, ambitious, and unwilling to accept limitations based on her gender. When Cochran proposed the idea of a women's pilot program to the military, she was already an accomplished aviator. She understood the capabilities of women pilots because she was one herself. She had proven, through her own achievements, that women could fly as well as men. She used this credibility to advocate for the WASP program. As director of the WASP program, Cochran was demanding and exacting. She expected the women pilots under her command to meet the highest standards. She pushed them to excel. She fought with military officials to ensure that the women pilots received good assignments and were treated fairly. She was a leader in the truest sense. She inspired the women under her command to achieve extraordinary things. Another legendary WASP pilot was Geraldine, Gerry, Doyle. Doyle was known for her exceptional flying skills and her fearlessness. She was one of the first women pilots to fly advanced fighter aircraft. She completed dangerous missions with precision and dedication. During the war, Doyle tested experimental aircraft designs and modifications. She flew in some of the most demanding conditions and dangerous situations that any pilot faced during the war. After the war, Doyle continued her aviation career, but she was often frustrated by the barriers and discrimination that women pilots continued to face. She eventually became a commercial airline pilot, but she had to fight for every opportunity and every advancement. Despite the obstacles, she remained committed to aviation and to proving that women belonged in the cockpit. Nancy Harkness Love was another crucial figure in the WASP program. Love was an accomplished pilot herself, and she became the first director of the WASP program before Jacqueline Cochran took over. Love was instrumental in establishing the standards and procedures that would define the WASP program. She trained the early cohorts of WASP pilots and helped prove that women could handle the program. Love's contributions were crucial, but her role was often overshadowed by Cochran's more prominent public presence. This is itself an example of how history can minimize and erase women's contributions. Love was a leader and innovator, but she received less recognition than her male counterparts and less recognition than she deserved. Jackie Cochran's own experiences reveal both the possibilities and the limitations of the WASP program. Despite her exceptional achievements and her position as director of the program, Cochran herself faced limitations and discrimination. She wanted to fly combat missions. She pushed the military to allow her to fly fighters in combat. But even with all her qualifications and achievements, the military refused. Women pilots, they said, simply couldn't fly in combat. This restriction highlights a crucial limitation of the WASP program. While it proved that women could fly military aircraft, it didn't result in women being fully integrated into military aviation. Women pilots were restricted to non-combat roles. They couldn't fly in combat. They couldn't be commissioned as military officers. They were, in many ways, second-class pilots serving in a program that was tolerated only because of the desperate need for ferry pilots. The WASP pilots came from diverse backgrounds. Some were from wealthy families with access to private aviation. Others came from working-class backgrounds and had to work for every flying opportunity they got. Some were naturally talented pilots who took to flying immediately. Others had to work hard to develop their skills. But what unified all of the WASP pilots was their determination to serve their country and their willingness to face discrimination and hostility for the opportunity to contribute. They were women who refused to accept the limitations that society placed on them. They were women who believed they could do something extraordinary, and they proved it. Many of the WASP pilots continued their aviation careers after the war, though they often faced barriers and limitations. Some became commercial airline pilots. Some became flight instructors. Some worked in aviation-related fields. Many had to work harder than male pilots to achieve the same positions and recognition. The personal stories of the WASP pilots reveal the human cost of discrimination and erasure. These women had dedicated their lives to aviation and to serving their country. But when the war ended, their contributions were minimized, their achievements were forgotten, and they had to fight for decades to get official recognition of what they had accomplished. The story of the women Air Force service pilots is a story about courage, dedication, and the power of proof. When the WASP program began, there was widespread skepticism about whether women could pilot military aircraft. But the WASP pilots didn't just talk about capability. They proved it. Through thousands of missions, through hundreds of thousands of flight hours, through every type of military aircraft, they demonstrated unequivocally that women could fly military aircraft safely and effectively. This proof had consequences. It shattered assumptions. It challenged stereotypes. It forced people to confront their own prejudices and preconceived notions. The tragedy of the WASP story is not that the program failed. It's that the program succeeded, but its success was denied and erased. The WASP pilots proved what everyone needed to know. But instead of being celebrated for their achievements, they were discharged and forgotten. This erasure is a reminder of something important about history. History is not objective. Historical narratives are constructed by people who have power and influence. If powerful people decide that certain stories should be forgotten, then those stories can disappear from historical memory. But the erasure of WASP history also demonstrates the power of recovery and restoration. Through the work of historians, through the testimony of surviving WASP pilots, through changing social attitudes about gender and service, the story of the WASP pilots has been recovered. Their achievements have been restored to the historical record. The WASP pilots flew faster than fighter pilots. They tested aircraft that had never been flown before. They delivered aircraft to combat zones. They proved their capability thousands of times over. Yet for decades, history forgot them. The lesson of the WASP is that we need to be vigilant about whose stories are told and whose stories are forgotten. We need to recognize that historical narratives can be shaped by prejudice and power. We need to work to recover and preserve the stories of people whose contributions have been erased or minimized. The WASP pilots should be celebrated not just for their flying skills and their service to their country, but for breaking barriers and challenging assumptions about what women could accomplish. They should be remembered as pioneers who proved that gender does not determine capability. The legacy of the WASP pilots continues today in every woman who flies military aircraft, in every woman who pursues a career in aviation, in every woman who refuses to accept limitations based on gender. The women of the WASP took to the skies in the 1940s. They faced skepticism, discrimination, and hostility. They flew in dangerous conditions and challenging circumstances. They proved themselves repeatedly. They changed what was possible for women in aviation and in the military. They flew faster than fighter pilots. But history tried to erase them. It took courage and dedication from historians and surviving pilots to recover their story and restore their place in history. This is the legacy of the WASP. Women who flew. Women who proved. Women who changed the course of aviation history. Women whose story, once forgotten, has been recovered and can now inspire future generations.